Hi, I'm Colin. I'm the CTO of ZKX Solutions. We often get asked how our flagship product, the ZKX MFA engine, is going to support new and emerging authentication initiatives, such as the ones encapsulated by this new idea of passwordless authentication. There's been sort of an industry trend focused on killing or retiring the password, and this discontinuation campaign certainly has the right ideas in mind. Passwords as an authentication tool certainly have showcased their technological shortcomings in recent memory. As consumers of cybersecurity information, we routinely see headline after headline of sensitive databases being breached all the time due to leaked or hard-coded credentials being used to safeguard sensitive personal information of either end users or the operators that exist on these various networks. While discontinuation campaigns against the password certainly boast the right grievances, we believe that their primary arguments are misplaced against the password. Password-based authentication classically functions in an architecture known as symmetric. This word symmetric refers to the expectations of knowledge on both ends of the authentication transaction. On one hand, we have the party doing the authenticating, typically the user or known as the client side. On the other hand, we have the organization that owns the resource, typically known as the server side. In this symmetric architecture, the expectation of knowledge is that both sides of this transaction are privy to the piece of information being used to authenticate the user. In this context, the password. When a user enrolls for an account or a service that's owned by the organization, they are typically required to specify a couple of things. Primarily, one, some kind of identifier for the account name that will own the resource or the service that they're enrolling for, typically a username or an email address, and some secret specific string of information that they're going to use to prove their ownership of the account that owns access to this resource or service. Here in this conversation, we're talking about the password. In this traditional symmetric architecture, we have both the client and the server privy to what that password may be. The symmetric nature of classic password-based authentication is problematic in a couple of different ways. But one of the most important is this idea of what's known as the attack surface. For a cyber adversary, or a malicious user that's attempting to learn the user's password in this example, there are two avenues that they can attack in order to succeed in gleaning what the user's password may be. On the user side, they have the traditional cybersecurity attacks that we are all familiar with in some degree: phishing, spear phishing, or other flavors of social engineering. Other cyber tactics such as malware can also be used to steal a user's password right out from under them on the client side of the transaction. On the server side, a cyber adversary could choose to attack the server or database architecture itself. If something in the data storage mechanisms are misconfigured or outdated, a cyber adversary can find a foothold for exploitation to eventually glean that user's password just from the storage locale. In order to protect either end of this authentication transaction, we're all familiar to some degree with the protective mechanisms that are currently in place in the modern cybersecurity era. On the user side, we're all familiar with the cybersecurity awareness training that we all suffer to some legally mandated degree. On the server side, we're familiar with certain data storage or obfuscation tactics meant to further protect the static information that represents the user's password, particularly through the use of mechanisms known as salting and hashing, such that if an adversary were to gain illegitimate access to this data server, they wouldn't be able to know what the passwords are just by looking at them. While these tools certainly have been helpful in getting us to the point where we are today as an industry, they definitely aren't perfect. On the client side, users are still phished so frequently that phishing and other social engineering vectors is still the #1 way in which adversaries are infiltrating commercial or industry networks. Likewise, the cybersecurity awareness training that we're all forced to endure adds friction to our day-to-day operations and ultimately lowers our standard of cybersecurity culture that our organizations are able to cultivate for us, the end user or technological consumer. On the server side, while those protective mechanisms such as salting and hashing these password strings might be very useful, there are adversarial tools such as rainbow tables that attackers can use once a database is breached to sort of reverse engineer the information that went into creating that salted and hashed string that sits in that database. Many have focused on these weaknesses as the core shortcomings of the password and why it should ultimately be retired from the sphere of cyber operations. At ZKX Solutions, we are firm proponents of the idea that the password is not to blame for these security shortcomings. In fact, it is simply guilty by association by being lumped in with this symmetric authentication architecture. Our flagship product, the ZKX MFA engine, allows your end users to still employ their passwords on a day-to-day basis while removing those two attack avenues that exist and are so prevalent in classic password-based authentication. We do this by removing the symmetric nature of the architecture that underlies the traditional password. In the ZKX paradigm, all transactions are asymmetric, meaning the expectations of knowledge are not equal between both the client and server side of the authenticating transaction. ZKX MFA is actually so slanted in favor of the user that the organization that authenticates the user or owns the resource or platform that the user is authenticating themselves to can never learn any single one bit, any single 1 or 0 about what the user's password may be, other than the fact that they do indeed know what their password is. You may be familiar with emerging authentication technologies with a primary focus on passwordless authentication, such as the passkey. While these authentication technologies are good from a theoretical standpoint, early reports are emerging that users are actually somewhat uncomfortable with using this passwordless form of authentication, seeing that it's not an intuitive process for them and they're not convinced that these transactions are indeed secure when they're taking place. Passwords, on the other hand, are familiar to the user and make intuitive sense as to how and why the transactions that users engage in with their password are secure. At ZKX Solutions, our technologies that we develop aim to do just that, to bring that idea to reality that passwords are indeed secure. In fact, we're so purpose-built for making the password such a critical linchpin for the future of securing cyber operations that we can support even what's traditionally known as bad password practices, such as reusing passwords between different sites or employing passwords that are relatively simplistic in nature. The ZKX MFA engine alleviates those policy-level burdens by making the password as simple as possible. We do this simply with good technology and straightforward engineering. This intuitive, easy-to-use, and straightforward technology allows your organization to generate a sufficient body of workable policy that is realistic for your users to abide by. This, in turn, cultivates a good operating culture that will enable your operators, your end users, and your cyber technicians the ability and freedom to succeed in their day-to-day operations. We all know and understand why the password gets the bad rap that it does. Here at ZKX Solutions, we have solved that issue. We can enable your users to still utilize the password, still employ the authentication that they know and love on an intuitive level, while improving the threshold of cybersecurity up to the new standard which many organizations require to move forward into the future. At ZKX Solutions, we argue that it's not the password that needs retiring, rather the outdated and insecure symmetric architecture that currently underlies password-based authentication. By focusing not on the removal of the password, but on the removal of this shared expectation of knowledge on either end of the client and server transaction, we can enable ourselves and the industry writ large to continue to bring the password into the future and use it to continue to secure even our most sensitive assets.